Never go to the farm, Catherine. Promise me. Those words were a ribbon around my throat, the way a soundbite can be when it belongs to someone you still touch in memory. I said the promise aloud at the funeral, the way people say small vows to keep the dead from rolling in their graves. Automatic, ceremonial. I meant it then, for the shape of my grief made me cling to anything that kept Joshua ordinary. He'd been ordinary in the best, most deceptive way. Ordinary at breakfast, ordinary at the easel, ordinary in his sudden private decisions. Ordinary until the day he wasn't. 2 weeks later, I held an antique brass key atween my fingers as if it might burn. It came wrapped in cheap brown paper and a single silk maple leaf stuck under the twine. The handwriting on the envelope was Joshua's, careful, crooked, the way he signed letters when he wanted me to read them more than once. Inside, a deed in a blue folder stamped with a notary seal. A note that said simply, Maple Creek Farm, Alberta. And beneath that, a second, smaller sealed envelope labeled in his hand, For when you're ready, videos. A list of files, a silver laptop tokened with a pressed red rose tucked under the screen. He had asked me not to go. He'd asked for a promise that felt at the moment like a kindness. Don't make me haunt you in the day, he joked in the hospice corridor, and I laughed because when we were young, we'd made absurd vows to keep death from its proper business. But at the funeral, with his friends and my neighbors murmuring about arrangements and how suddenly everything had shifted, that promise bloomed into a chain I couldn't shrug. I didn't want to leave the house that smelled of his aftershave and turpentine. I didn't want to walk into whatever plans he'd made without his hands on the rail. And yet, the deed, the key, the maple leaf, they were a quiet insistence. Joshua was not a man who left things undone. If that farm existed, if he had purchased and tended to it alone by night while I slept beside him through better hours, then the life we'd imagined, one of gentler mornings and empty rooms full of paintings, might not be an accusation, but an invitation. Or a trap. That distinction was Joshua's to make. I went because grief makes you curious in a way that tastes like hunger. It also makes you brave in ways you wouldn't have been when you were whole. I told no one I was going, except Jenna. I called her because it felt right that she know where her father's last secret was. She was 27 and more likely than I to be practical when sorrow tried to dress itself in theatrics. She told me, in that thin, cracking voice of hers, to be careful. Her practical is worry deepened by loyalty. The drive to Maple Creek took longer than the map suggested. There were places on that road where the world thinned and gave you the sensation you were driving into a painting. Maple trees feathered in early frost, their leaves turning the color of old coins. The gate was iron and low, with Joshua's name etched into a brass plate. The gravel spat under my tires like a chorus of tiny, judgmental voices. The farmhouse rose like a held breath, long, careful lines, warm brick, the late winter light catching on a porch swing he must have always meant to sit in. I found the key caught to the inside of my coat by a small brass ring. I held it up against the lock, the metal cold with the smell of cedar. Behind the threshold, the house didn't feel empty the way a museum does. This had been lived in, beloved. An easel with a canvas half scraped of color, a mug with faint coffee stains edged like a map of someone else's mornings, a scarf slung over the railing where, in some quicker memory, Joshua had said he would wait for me to come in from a storm. There were horses' muffled breaths from the barn, the hoofbeats a steady domestic punctuation. On the kitchen table, the blue folder sat under a small bowl of river stones. A laptop hummed on a side table. The rose, pressed and glossy, lay beneath the screen like a signature. I didn't turn it on at first. Instead, I walked the rooms like a thief returning something lost. The studio where he'd set up a life for me, wide windows, light that would make anyone who knew acreage jealous, had a single blank stretched canvas leaning against the wall. I touched the linen and felt beneath the primer the ghost of his fingerprints. When I finally opened the laptop, the password prompt blinked at me like an invitation. There was a sticky note on the edge of the screen. If you can't, call Mr. Winters, Minnesota. Beneath that, written in his curved, familiar hand, the first one is obvious. I typed in his name. The desktop opened to a solitary folder labeled for Catherine, one a day. There were 275 files. A video file named Day 1. I had to pretend I wasn't shaking when I clicked it. A face filled the frame. Joshua, older than when he painted, but the same eyes, warm, a little watery, like a man who had been looking at light through a window for too long. He leaned back from the camera and smiled in that secretive way of his, the smile that once made a waiter come over to ask if we were celebrating anything. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone," he said. He didn't need to nail his statement to the center of my skull. Any widow knows the tonic of those words. Still, when he said them, something in me untied. He kept looking at the camera as if it were me, as if he were looking through my neck to the place where grief lived. "You promised you'd never go to the farm, and you promised you'd keep me ordinary. So you're going to break one and keep the other in your own way." There was a softness in his voice that made me think he was trying to be kind to the person I would become rather than to the person I was. He spoke with the calm precision he'd kept for years when he addressed a canvas. "I left you a map." Not just a map of property lines, but a map of what I thought would keep you safe. I could not leave you a life without making sure you had the parts you needed. There are things I couldn't tell you in the day, Catherine, so I told them in film. His hands came into the frame, smoothing a sheet of paper, some map or chart I couldn't make out. He laughed quietly, and for a suspended second, I heard the man I had lived with for 30 years, ordinary and brilliant and careless of the obvious. "Promise me this," he continued. "Promise you'll watch them. One a day, that's the bargain. And promise you'll lock the door behind you when the Mitchells come looking." He was joking about the Mitchells in the way that people joke about predators in the dark, to make the predators sound ordinary. I had known Joshua's family from a distance, 3 brothers shaped by an older, sharper world than mine. Men who'd learned to measure worth by ledgers and to win by being louder. Implication is a kind of rope. He'd left me one. I paused the video because my eyes were full and because moving felt like a betrayal. I placed the cherry silk rose between my fingers and felt the textured press of it like a talisman. If you want the next chapter of this story, like and subscribe. It was absurd. And then it wasn't. There, at the edge of my grief, Joshua's private humor had translated into a public cadence I recognized from late-night television. Of course I smiled. The smile startled me, small, ridiculous. It was a human reflex, to humor even where the heart ached. The knock came at the door while I was rewinding the video to watch the fold of his hand again. It was 3 knocks, deliberate, polite, practiced with legal strategy. Before I could deliver the ritual of smoothing a dress I no longer wore, voices drifted in from the porch, men's voices, too practiced in argument to be anything but rehearsed. Mrs. Mitchell, a man I did not yet see, called like a performance. "Mrs. Catherine Jameson, we represent Joshua's kin. We seek a discussion of the estate." I crossed the hall as if walking toward an ambush. The porch was lit by winter sun that made the dust on the mat glitter like old coins. There were 3 of them on the last step down, each folded in their own certainty. Robert, the oldest, was a square of muscle and civility, the kind of man who measures apology by the size of his tie. Alan, the middle, wore a lawyer's expression even in casual clothes, facial muscles attuned to parsing. David, the youngest, looked like he had been handed danger and thought it was a new toy. They were all Mitchells and, predictably, armed with blue folders. "You can't be here," I said. The sentence was ordinary. I wanted ordinariness then as a kind of armor. "We represent the estate," Robert said, with a civility that smelled faintly of old cigars. "We have questions about the deed, Miss Jameson." "The initial arrangements?" "Joshua left me this house," I said, laying the deed on the table between our hands. The paper was crisp under my palm. I let it show. "It's recorded. Mr. Winters can verify the notary dates." At the porch edge, Alan's hand hovered over a phone. His smile was smooth. "You must understand, the family has an interest, mineral rights, partnerships that might not have been fully developed." Now it was my throat that tightened. I'd never thought in terms of mineral rights. In our marriage, Joshua handled the world of contracts and property in the way other people handle baking bread. He took to it easily, and he didn't tell me when he had made a loaf. If he had bought a farm in secret while I went to the market for paint, I had trusted him to keep his hands steady. "We'll have the RCMP confirm the deeds," Alan said, "for everyone's peace of mind." "Peace of mind," Robert echoed, as though the words were currency he'd be willing to exchange for a portion of something he believed belonged to him. The knock changed the tone of the house. The horses shifted somewhere in the back. The sound of hooves was a small, private theater of life continuing. I told them, politely, that they could not come in without an invitation. In the same breath, I called the number on the sticky note, Mr. Winters in Minnesota. He answered in a minute that felt as if it had been stretched by the law of small towns. His voice was grave and efficient. He said he would contact the local constable and confirm the deed electronically. It was the sort of thing men in suits hate, waiting for documentation. But they'd brought documents, and yet documents live in versions. Alan opened his blue folder and slid a stack of photocopies across the threshold like a peace offering that cost nothing. They talked of family obligations, of communal stewardship, of Joshua's temperament. The words were designed to make me feel like a steward who had been careless. They were polite cruelty. When Constable Wilson finally arrived, the air contracted like a lung exhaling. He was younger than I imagined a constable would be, with kind eyes and a notebook. He carried himself as if sympathy were an occupational hazard. He examined the deed, his fingers tracing the seal. "Ms. Jameson, the deed is in your name, but there's been a notice filed by the Mitchell estate to contest certain aspects. For now, until legal counsel clarifies, I can't prevent the brothers from making inquiries." Alan's jaw tightened. "We only want to insure." "You can insure it in court," I said softly, and the quiet was a small weapon between my ribs. "You are welcome to come through the parlor and sit in chairs and be human, but you will not touch anything private. You understand? If you come in without consent, I will have you trespassed." It was theatrical, perhaps, to the point of melodrama. I was, at that moment, more theatrical than wise. The Mitchells' faces darkened with the rarity of being turned away with decorum. Robert muttered something about family duty. David made a face at me and then walked toward the barn door as if he had some sort of ownership to test. I felt the camera of Joshua's videos on the table like a third presence. There was a gravity that didn't belong to the men standing on my porch, but to the unseen man who'd left me this inheritance he warned me against. I closed the laptop in a small, decisive motion. That day, I locked the door. Once they were gone, or at least sent back to the irregular business of their own pride, I walked the grounds. The barn smelt of hay and horsehair and something else, oil, faint and metallic, like a distant hint of a possibility I didn't want to name. A bay mare followed me with patient eyes. The stable manager, Ellis, appeared from a stall, wiping his hands on a rag. He had the gait of a man who'd learned to work with animals after he'd run with troubles. There was a scar along his jaw that didn't speak of anything I asked to be told. "You must be Catherine," he said, as if the farm had been waiting for my arrival to rearrange itself. "Mr. Joshua spoke of you. I run the stables. Midnight's my name for the horse. He likes you." He offered me the sort of practical kindness that is distinct from sentimental mercy. In his pocket was an old brass key on a ring with a maple leaf charm, a spare that matched the one around my neck. He told me plainly that the place had been rebuilt. Joshua had poured money into the stones and wood like a man rebuilding a heart. He showed me the tack room, the fields, the new fence posts. Even at that, Ellis watched me more than he watched the horses, like a man cataloging how a person looked at what was given to them. "You should see the studio," he said finally. "He told me once he wanted you to have space to paint, said it would be your room again. We've kept it as he left it." The studio did something to me like gravity. Light fell across an empty easel and a chair with Joshua's old paint-streaked jacket draped over it. The air smelt faintly of turpentine and wood glue and the kind of dust you find only in rooms used for art. There were brushes and jars, palettes crusted with colors. In a corner, against the wall, a half-finished canvas waited, and on the bench beneath it, a small envelope with my name written across it. I opened it with the care one applies to letters from the living. Inside was a short note, no more than a line. "For when you forget, the world is patient." There were more videos on the laptop, pages of them, but Joshua's first message had already set a cadence. The second video, which I watched that night with the house folding around me like a cloak, was more practical. He spoke of doctors, of a diagnosis, the words fashioning themselves into things I would have had to call by their proper names if I'd been allowed. He said he'd known for a while. He called the condition HCM and explained in that slow, teacherly way that had been part of how he loved people by making them understand the shape of their own fear, that he'd run the numbers and made a plan. He'd planned for the grief he would cause me by keeping it from me. He'd planned for the greed of his brothers. "Don't let them make this small," Joshua said in a video that smelled of lemon oil and the small dust of his studio. "I know how they think. I know where they'll look and what they'll assume. I bought more than a house. I bought mitigation and routes. There are maps that show where things sit, and there are documents that show what they have done. You will need Mr. Winters, and you will need a new definition of family in the meantime." He never said the word trick in his voice. He arranged things like an artist arranging a composition. He put light where he wanted me to look, and shadow where he wanted me to tread lightly. The tone made something in me bloom with a fierce, inconvenient gratitude. He had been alive and doing business on my behalf in the way a general plans an entire strategy for a battle he knows he'll not live to see. I woke the next morning to snow on the maples. The Mitchells had not left quietly. They had strutted down the lane with the swagger of men convinced that possession has a moral right of its own. Jenna's name had drifted into the loom of their conversation like a thread they hoped to pull loose. They knew things about our family I hadn't even been told. The audacity of their civilities felt like slaps endorsed by law. They spoke of offers for Jenna, of future prospects, of the practicalities of moving her into a life that would keep the estate in the family. Their words were coated with an invitation and a threat on the edge of every sentence. Cooperation would be rewarded, refusal would be painful. At lunch, Jenna appeared on the porch with the kind of uncertainty you can see as easily as weather. She wore Joshua's watch on a chain around her neck. He'd given it to her the summer she turned 12, and she had never taken it off. She looked at me with the rehearsed composure of someone who had been taught to keep grief tidy. "I didn't know if you'd want me here," she said. Her fingers toyed with the watch. "Dad's things. He left me a letter. He said you were looking after me." There was that thin, raw cord of standing between two people whose father had used a lot of language for care and very little for certainty. Jenna's loyalty felt like a river that could go either way. The Mitchells had tried their first lines of seduction, gently suggesting opportunities, internships with their businesses, a placement that would tie Jenna to their interests and not to the messy work of grieving. It was subtle. It was also a feint. I watched her listen to them the way you watch a bird deciding whether a hand to feed tasted like food or poison. "Stay," I said simply. "Stay for a while if you want to. This place will make space for us if we let it." She crossed the room and sat where she had always sat as a child, on the arm of the old sofa where her father would read aloud and slip a hand into hers. She looked at the laptop with an expression I recognized as both hunger and fear. "Are you watching them?" she whispered, referring to the videos. "All of them?" "One a day," I told her, echoing Joshua's rule back at the two of us as if reciting a prayer. "One a day. They are a map." She stayed for a week. The Mitchells left and returned with legal papers flagged like little torches. Alan sent an attorney, Mr. Pearson, who liked efficient language and the smell of risk. He asked gentle questions from the porch. Robert tried the tactic of old brotherly concern, and David alternately shrugged or made insinuations about the viability of the farm. Their interest was not poetic, it was ledgered. While they negotiated, Joshua's videos unraveled in sequence. He told us, in the third layer of his deliberate way, not merely of diagnosis, but of investment. He had found one route people seldom look at, the underlayer of a farm, the hum beneath the soil. He'd hired geologists on the sly and had maps that showed different red veins than the ones the market had circled. Those veins weren't necessarily fortune in the voluptuous, world-changing sense. They were leverage. Enough to call certain people to the table and to bind the property to obligations that would require oversight beyond the selfish interests of three men who liked to think themselves entitled. "He called it insurance," Jenna said over coffee one gray morning. She had watched one of the later videos, one where Joshua spelled out the logistics like a man reading a recipe. He said he didn't want us to be at the mercy of men who think money is the only language. The word insurance is the sort of thing you say when you are trying to turn contingency into calm. But what Joshua had left was not merely a set of financial plans. Buried under the studio floor, behind a false bulkhead in the pantry, I found a stair hatch. The hatch was the sort of thing you only notice because some part of you knows the house is too honest for its own secrets. It took Ellis's key to get it open. He did so with the sort of resigned curiosity that said he'd known there were things Joshua kept beneath his broad, civilized manners. The stairway angled down into the earth and smelled of cold stone and the kind of safety deposit boxes that look like sanctuaries. The space was small but whole. Maps pinned to walls, surveyor scrolls, a wooden table with a single lamp. There were labeled manila folders, photographs, drilling reports, and a hand-drawn map that showed red lines not on property boundaries but on the slant of subsoil and the pockets beneath. "What is all this?" Jenna asked. She had followed me down the stairs without asking. The light illuminated the small, precise nature of a man's private industry. Joshua's handwriting looped across the papers like a cartographer's signature. "This is his war room," Ellis said, in a voice that made the phrase sound like a thing you'd put in a museum. "This is what he wanted to leave you." His war room, I echoed, feeling a rush of every emotion a mind can pretend are separate. Betrayal, gratitude, grief, anger. He had prepared not only for grief, but for the appetites he expected to wake at his name. He had stacked evidence in a place where someone could stand and lay out a case, not for revenge, but for protection. There were geological surveys with marked strata, letters to independent consultants, and, folded inside a drawer, a sheaf of documents labeled Mitchell Account Audits. Joshua's careful notes lay across them, annotating charges and transfers with a hand that bled the sort of indignation that arises from having sat across a table and been cheated. Nothing in those folders accused beyond what the paper showed. They were records, not invective, bank transfers that didn't balance, signatures that looked almost like a man's, and transactions that did not match the purpose for which funds had been supposedly allocated. I could feel the strategy forming in my limbs like muscle memory. Joshua had built a nest of refuse for predators, and woven into it, as a hummingbird threads nectar into a flower, enough sweetness that the right people would come and the wrong people would reveal themselves in the way they move. Down there, in the small bunker under the kitchen, Joshua's voice flickered on one of the videos that unspooled like prayer beads. He spoke not of cruelty, but of stewardship. If they come for the land because of what sits below, he said, make them meet the right cartographers. Make them meet people who will measure against truth, not appetite. As I traced the red marks on the map with a finger warmed by the light, a new sound came from above, an engine, the Mitchells returning, or perhaps a new car. The house settled that way the world does when a pebble finally reaches the center of the pond. I had turned a corner into an architecture of defense that had nothing to do with legalities and everything to do with revelation. There was a moment, one of those thin seconds in long days, when you let the logic of what has been carefully put in place collate in the quiet room of your bones. It is the kind of moment that can become the hinge of a life. Joshua's gestures, the key, the studio, the bunker, the maps, they had all been a series of small betrayals to the truth so that the truth might become a shield. We lifted the folders and the maps up out of the earth as if we were raising someone up to a light. Jenna's fingers trembled when she touched the blue folder labeled Mitchell Account Audits. Her eyes met mine, and I saw, in the smallness of her pupils, a decision being made. There was fear, certainly. There was also something like resolve. Outside, the Mitchells' car salted the driveway. Robert's voice carried up the steps in a new register, the voice of a man who thinks he owns more than property. "Catherine," he called, "we need to sit down. It's time to talk terms." I rose from the war room with the map like a talisman and felt for the first time since they'd put Joshua in the ground the heavy lift of an answer shaping itself in me. The house was a stage now, and the audience had taken its seats. Joshua had left more than a deed. He had left me the means to be sharper than my sorrow. I thought that afternoon of ordinary things, how a person will ask to be left alone and then use every scrap of another's intelligence to stand back up. I thought about promises and how they twist. Joshua had asked me not to go to the farm. He had done so because he was small and human enough to want to spare me the immediate pain. He lied, perhaps by omission. He had tricked, not for malice, but for a kind of protection. If this was a trick, it was also an education. He had taught me the language of property and the grammar of maps without ever sitting me down as if I were a child. The war room had not been built to entrap my brothers in a trap of cruelty. It had been composed like a suite that would compel them to show their own bottom lines. The difference between a trap and a test is morality and action, and Joshua had chosen the latter in the quietness of not being able to hold my hand when the needle touched the skin. As the footsteps came closer in the house above and the voices settled into a tone that was designed to wear me down with civility, I took the map with steady hands and thought of how one might proceed when grief is a weapon. There were legalities to prepare for. There was Mr. Winters in Minnesota, who was already on his way. There was also Ellis, who had a way of reading men like open books, and Jenna, who could still be taught to see what a map looks like when you know the difference between what is claimed and what is kept. There were Joshua's videos, one a day like bread, to nurse me through thin mornings. The first part of the storm was only forming, a cold front that promised to test the lines Joshua had drawn. In the basement, under the pantry, his red marks glowed faintly in the lamp's light, like coals waiting for breath. When Robert knocked a second time and Alan announced that their attorney would like to look at the documents, I felt, in a place that was equal parts fear and calm, that we had exactly what we needed: evidence, a plan, and a man who had known enough to leave me the tools. I tucked the map into my coat and closed the trapdoor lightly behind me. The house continued to breathe around me, the muffled sound of footsteps above, the emptiness of the studio waiting, a blank canvas ready to be filled not with the exact colors of the days gone, but with the strange, salvaged palette Joshua had arranged for me. The day was not done, and their civility was not exhaustion, but a prelude. We had inherited a legacy that was not only a place, but a choice: to let Joshua's careful deceit be a kind of mercy, or to allow it to become yet another field for the hungry. I walked up the stairs into a house that had been intended as a fortress and a sanctuary simultaneously, and as the Mitchells' voices again reached me, calm, practiced, entitled, I felt the length of the fight take shape in my hands. I answered the door with the map in my coat, and something like a plan pressed into the hollow of my ribs. They had come expecting a widow to be bewildered between grief and inheritance. They had not expected a woman who had crawled into the basement and read the handwriting of a man who had thought wars through in pencil. Mr. Winters called within the hour. His voice was a quick, kind thing that did not waste words. "Catherine," he said, "you did well not to let them in. Do not sign anything. Do not consent to testing or transfers without counsel. I will have a colleague meet you, local counsel, who knows land claims and mineral rights up here. Hold the property. I'll file notice and freeze on any immediate transfers until we see a judge." There was an ease in his instructions that felt like a rope thrown to someone who had been treading for too long. He knew how to hold a place steady until the proper tools arrived. He also said, in the offhand way of men who are used to seeing people's lives turned like pages, "And, Catherine, this is his style. He left you a lot. Use it." Use it. The words were practical and slightly theatrical when they came out of a lawyer's mouth, but I let them sit in me like a benediction. I hung up, breathed, and thought about the next video in the folder. Joshua had made me wait a day for the rhythm of instruction. I did not yet feel like a person who could live a day on her own. I needed the map of how to behave, the way to make the house into a strategy and not merely an object of mourning. The next morning, Alan and Mr. Pearson, the brother's attorney, escalated. They came with language that smelled of the boardroom. "We must consider all options for continuity," Alan said, as though continuity were something you could politely negotiate over the best china. He watched Jenna with a look that moved between predation and feigned benevolence. At one point, he mentioned, casually, the possibility of medical testing for Jenna in relation to an unresolved family health matter. The words landed like a stone in glass. The implication was crystalline and ugly. I felt the air in my lungs change. My mind, a teacher's mind, cataloged the ethical problems like nouns set into a sentence: coercion, consent, conflict of interest. The brothers framed it as care, but the phrasing, in relation to family health, left an edge of transaction. "Who suggested that?"
I asked, and I do not think the surprise came out small. Alan's smile was the rehearsed thing of a man who has used concern as leverage before. Doctor,
Harmon mentioned it in passing, he said, as though forwarding a rumor were proof. We thought for Jenna's benefit. Jenna's reaction was a study in confusion. She had been fragile since the funeral, but also hungry for anything that promised to anchor her to history. Dad, did he... she started, and then stopped, because what she wanted to know was not whether Joshua had known, but whether he had asked. She held his watch in both hands like a talisman. I could see with terrible clarity what would happen if we allowed the brothers to initiate testing. They would dress it in care, get Jenna alone in a clinical room with a form and a counselor, and leave behind the kind of paper that could be used as moral leverage later. They had the language of kindness, practiced and practiced until it sounded like mercy. It is a dangerous thing for someone who remembers how the Mitchells compile conversational weapons to be left to the mercy of forms. Joshua's videos were a slow, private instruction manual. The rule about one a day had been partly for my emotional digestion, and partly, I now suspected, to create time. Time to read, time to prepare, time to gather witnesses. In a video, he had said, without flourish, that if they moved to test Jenna, they had to be made to do so in consultation with independent parties and always with full legal counsel present. He spelled out names of clinics and a list of independent genetic counselors to whom Mr. Winters could speak. He had included as well contact information for half-siblings, people whose presence might make clinical testing less likely to center Jenna as a single source of a solution. If they come after her with testing, he said in that quiet way that made you feel that he's both admonishing and comforting at once, make sure the clinic is neutral. Make sure there's independent counsel, and find me someone who will say no to a form when a form is a weapon. I took the video as instruction and as permission. The agreement was a map to moral clarity. We would not be manipulated. Jenna would not be set up to sign away autonomy because men in shirts liked the feel of making decisions on her behalf. Mr. Winters arranged for local counsel to come, a woman named Lillian Archer, who arrived with a briskness that smelled faintly of coffee and resolve. She read the folders in the war room with a gaze that was both forensic and sympathetic. "We've got the deeds in order," she said. "We can file to bar any unilateral testing of a minor or dependent without clear consent and without the presence of an independent advocate. We can issue a protective letter to any clinic that might be approached, and we can arrange for an independent genetic counselor to advise Jenna." Her sentences stitched my relief into something tangible. She also advised strategy. Let the Mitchells talk, let them overplay their hand. People with motives often leave footprints in the way they reach for what they want. "We will convene a meeting," Lillian said. "We will bring those who have real influence, industry folk who understand resource stewardship, and we will bind offers to conditions that prioritize environmental oversight and community trusts. We will make the property a piece of a larger conversation, not a prize to be grabbed." "The Mitchells will not like that," I said. "They usually don't like lawyers," Lillian replied, "but they like hitting pay dirt less than they like looking honorable in public. Their charm is brittle if you ask the right kind of questions." Her words were operative. Her plan was to create a public space in which to reveal what Joshua had left, maps, surveys, and the audit folders, and to place industry actors in the room who would not be tempted to cut corners for three loud men with a history of financial creativity. It was a chess move. Bring the market and the law together. Make truth a currency that cannot be bartered away. We put the meeting together with the quiet, relentless precision of people who had been taught to plan for storms. Joshua's records recommended two executives. One, Harrison Wells of Northern extraction,
had done well in northern leases and had a reputation for being pragmatic about stewardship. The other was Thomas Reeves of Western Plains Energy, a man who had more showmanship than conscience, but who could be useful if he was made to see the economic upside of a reputable deal. We invited them both on Joshua's terms, due diligence first, conditions for extraction that included restoration funds and a community oversight board. We invited, too, an independent geologist Joshua had used, Dr. Anna Mirza, whose reports had the careful, unromantic voice of a person who reads strata and spits out likelihoods. All the invitations came in Mr. Winter's voice, measured and neutral. I learned in the days that followed the strange power of timing. The Mitchells were hungry for speed. We were hungry for clarity. If they wanted to move fast, we would move the world in such a way that speed would require public scrutiny. But before the meeting could happen, the brothers tried another tack. They returned on a pale Thursday with Dr. Harmon in tow, an older man who smelled of antiseptic and wool. He presented himself as a family physician concerned for Jenna. Family health matters require expediency, he told me, in a tone meant to be soothing. If there is an opportunity to test a potential match, it may help. He had the look of a man who had spent his life softening hard things for people. When he asked Jenna to come with him to a clinic to determine the course of care, I felt the hair rise along the back of my neck. It was textbook. Separate the person from their advisor, make the request sound medical, paper it with forms, and then, later, use the narrative of care as justification for whatever came after. I remembered Joshua's warning about forms as weapons.
I also remembered the contact list he had assembled for half-siblings and the note that said, in a hand I knew by sight, if you need to say no loudly, do so. No sounded like a small cold stone in my mouth. But I found my voice. If there's to be testing of any kind, I said to Dr. Harmon and Alan and Robert, it will be in the presence of independent counsel and an independent genetic counselor. Jenna's consent matters more than your timetable. We will not be rushed. Alan's face changed twice, once in public and again in private. The first change was controlled. The second was something like irritation in the flat parts of his face. This is an unnecessary delay, he said. If this is purely medical, then ask Dr. Harmon to present the plan in writing, I interrupted. We will have Mr. Winters and Lillian confirm the clinical route. Jenna will speak with an independent counselor before any decision is made. They left with an air of wounded conscience. We had not yet set the meeting with executives and the map, but we had set a precedent. No testing without oversight. It was a small victory. Still, I felt the drain tidal. Grief does not go away in a week. It sutured itself to the days, slow and patient. Some nights I watched Joshua's videos and cried, and other nights I watched them and took notes into the margins of my brain like a person who had to become someone who could talk about strata and audits without trembling. Ellis was a quiet mainstay. He kept the horses and kept his judgment close to his chest. He had a past that did not read easily into any paragraph. He had a way of looking at people as if he were habituated to their inconsistencies. He became my confidant in the way that friends of grief sometimes do, not sacrificing anything, but offering steady presence. When I needed to go to town for paperwork or to meet Mr. Pearson in his sets of polite barbs, Ellis handled 1,000 small things. He also, more importantly, knew how to read a room full of men who thought their laughter was proof of ownership. "Let them come in and show their faces," he said once when I was pacing the great room. "But you make the room your stage, Mrs. Jameson. That's what Joshua would do. He'd make the truth unspoilable." I began to reconstruct the house for the coming meeting. Maps pinned to corkboards, photographic evidence of transfers flat on a table, Dr. Mirza's survey folded and ready. I asked Jenna to sit with me that evening, and we went through the videos together. There is a kind of intimacy in listening to a dead man's voice explain his reckoning.
It is a holiness of instruction, and it is also real guidance. Listen to him, I said, when a more strategic video popped up, Joshua's voice asking me to think in terms of leverage, not vengeance. He thinks in terms of who will want to be associated with good stewardship. He thinks, I stopped, because the word loyalty in that moment felt old-fashioned and necessary.
He thinks that if we can bind deals to restoration, they'll have to play by other people's rules. Jenna's face was a study of slow comprehension. Do you think you can? That they will listen? She asked. I don't know, I admitted, but I know the kind of men they are. They like appearance. They like to be viewed as reasonable in public. We will make them choose what they prefer publicly. We will make them choose the room that makes them look like thieves if they misbehave. The day of the meeting was a winter clarity. The maples had shed their last leaves, and the air arrived hard and honest. Lillian met Harrison Wells and Thomas Reeves at the kitchen table. Dr. Mirza set up her projector and unspooled a series of slides showing strata and deposits. Mr. Winters sat with a pleasant, unbothered air, like a man who had seen many fights and liked the math of them. We invited local press as part of a transparency move, not to sensationalize, but to create a public ledger of what took place. When Joshua had left his records, he had not done so with an assumption of privacy. He had assumed that truth might need witnesses. The Mitchells arrived in their best clothes, expressions ironed into their faces. Alan brought Mr. Pearson as his proxy in a show of legal bravado. Robert's smile was the same as always, practiced, not entirely real. The room held the tension of a stage before a reveal. I was not wholly comfortable in the suit I had borrowed for the meeting, Catherine in county court black and Grief in mourning. But it made the work of being taken seriously easier in people's eyes. Dress is a small tool of the world that sometimes acts like a key. The presentation began with Dr. Mirza's dry professionalism. She set out the geological surveys in ways that made even the layperson in attendance, constable, press, neighbors, sit forward. The tests Joshua commissioned identify subsurface deposits in a pocket that runs in a slightly different vector than regional expectations, she said. They are not guaranteed reserves in the sense of a producing field. However, they are economically significant in the area. What he planned, was to establish a stewardship model that would prevent short-term exploitation. She went on, methodically, with maps that turned the room's eyes to the same red lines we've seen in the bunker. She explained, simply and usefully, what the maps suggested. Leverage. It is a strange thing to watch people educated out of their blinkers. Harrison Wells listened with a head cocked in interest. Thomas Reeves watched with the kind of corporate calculation that measures everything in next quarter potential. When the time came for me to speak, I stood and felt the map like a warm object at my back. I did not rehearse a peal of righteous anger. Joshua's work demanded a calmer pitch. I told the room what the map showed. I told them what Joshua had done. He had quietly purchased the farm, commissioned reports, and compiled a dossier of financial transfers labeled Mitchell Account Audits. I told them that the records, which were open for inspection, indicated misallocations and transfers that did not align with stated purposes. These are documents Joshua preserved, I said. They are not an indictment, they are evidence that invites explanation. Mr. Pearson wheeled, and Alan's face collapsed into a scowl. This is hearsay, Mr. Pearson said with a lawyer's certainty. We contest any allegation not supported by court records. Fine, Lillian said, in a tone that suggested she had been waiting for this. We will open these documents for scrutiny, but also consider this. Gentlemen, your request to test Jenna without independent counsel looks, even in the gentlest of lights, like a maneuver designed to isolate and weaponize a person in the service of expediency.
That is not how you conduct ethical family care or financial restructuring. I watched Alan's jaw set. His mouth became a tight line. It is a strange thing to see men who profit from motion realize that one new motion, public transparency, would make their usual motion costly. We projected the audit pages in a way that invited simple questions. The bank transfers were there in black and white. Copies and reconciliations were laid out. The documents did not scream crime. They looked like accounting mistakes, reallocations that required justification. I did not call them thieves. I let the paper stand on its own. Joshua had not asked me to vilify. He had asked me to present truth and let it do its work. Harrison Wells, practical and not entirely without conscience, leaned toward his notes. If these numbers are accurate, he said, they suggest mismanagement. That is a reputational risk to anyone who might partner in extraction. My company will not be party to a field where community trust is a liability. Thomas Reeves, on the other hand, was a man of opportunities. He looked at the projected map and the press in the room and considered both like two columns on a ledger. We are particularly cautious about reputational risk, he said, in a voice pitched to the room. If any partnership proceeds, it proceeds under conditions of full transparency, environmental oversight, and community-led trust funds for restoration. We're not naive, but we do not like the smell of litigation or reputational damage. If there's a path forward that binds all parties to stewardship, there may be a path. I felt the room change. The Mitchells had entered expecting quick deals and private arrangements. They now stood before community oversight and corporations who, for the sake of their stock or image, preferred careful deals. Lillian's legal framing meant that any hurried attempt to wrest unsupervised control of Jenna or the property would be plainly visible.
It was at that moment, midway through the exchange, that Alan, always theatrical, made a move that was meant to be a pivot. "We will not be bullied," he said. "If the family is to be excluded from decisions, we will seek every legal remedy. This property, these rights, are our concern." Lillian set her hand on the table, palm down, and did something I would not have expected from a woman in her 30s. She smiled like a person who has been waiting for a polite bully to overreach. "Then let's put that legal process into the room," she said. "You can challenge us in court. Meanwhile, we will negotiate in good faith on terms that include restoration funds, a community oversight board, and a trust. For land stewardship, if you prefer to litigate, you'll be doing so under the eyes of industry and media. Either way, the notion that Jenna will be tested in private is unacceptable. We can agree to independent testing under counsel if you can demonstrate good faith and neutrality." Robert's face lost the practiced pallor of civility and turned something more honest: fear. "This is an attempt to freeze us out," he said, quietly, as if revealing a truth that might be read as weakness. "It is an attempt to ensure this property is not gutted by short-term greed," Lillian replied. "You can be part of the stewardship model, or you can litigate. The community won't be content with private profit if we've been shown something suspicious." The Mitchells left that day with a kind of brittle promise to consider their options. They tried later, via Mr. Pearson, to negotiate privately. We allowed the lawyers to trade drafts and terms, and the drafts began to look less like instruments of plunder and more like legal fetters. They offered someday payments and vague commitments that didn't bind them to anything concrete. We asked for restoration funding, oversight, and a trust that would require an independent board with caretaking obligations. We demanded that any medical testing for Jenna be done under independent counsel and with full informed consent. They refused some of the terms outright. They tried to use Jenna as a bargaining chip. We stood our ground.
The brothers' next move was small but vicious in the way small things can be, a smear mapping rumor across the small town that I had not been competent to manage Joshua's affairs. It was the sort of slight that may not survive the light, but is designed to distract. It was also, I learned, the way Joshua had anticipated they might behave. In one of his videos, he said, kindly, but with a soldier's clarity, watch how they try to make the moral argument sound like kindness. They will say they act in the family's best interest. They will not mean it. The trick is not to be tricked into defending your decency by being secretive. If they want to play in daylight, let them. If they want darkness, bring a lamp. We kept our lamp on.
That last matter, phased option, environmental oversight, trust funding, was what Joshua had envisioned as the limit of his trick. He had not wanted the land exploited without constraints. He had wanted the people he'd loved to have durable stewardship and not an ephemeral cash splurge. He had wanted, as he said in one of his film notes, to make sure the place lasted longer than a check. His stratagem had been not to hit his brothers with the force of vengeance, but to set traps made of consensus and visibility. We did not get everything. The settlement left the Mitchells with some financial acknowledgement, no criminalization in the record, nothing that said convicted or guilty, and the legal world is exacting in its demands for proof. What we did secure, with Lillian's precise maneuvers and the uncomfortable presence of industry actors, was protection. The trust and the oversight board were practical anchors. They made rapid, secret exploitation more costly than a public, constrained plan. The brothers were bound by legal agreements that required them to disclose deals and put funds into restoration. Those agreements were enforceable. That is not the same as final moral judgment, but it was a way to keep the farm from being turned into a plundered ledger. Jenna's arc, slow, painful, and finally resolute, was the part of the victory that felt human. She had been tempted by quick offers, stunned by being positioned as a possible donor, and hurt by the knowledge that her family had seen her as an instrument. But in watching the videos and participating in the meetings, she began to occupy a place in the narrative that was not reflexive. One day, sitting at the kitchen table, she slid a folder across to me. I read his audits, she said. I did. At first, I thought I'd be loyal to them. But then I thought about how Dad used to talk about rightness. He didn't mean justice as punishment. He meant that things should be fit for purpose. These papers, what they show, maybe it's time to be fit for something else. You're doing the right thing, I told her. And in that moment, right was less moral trumpeting and more the quiet work of becoming awake. She looked older than her 27 years then, not because she had suffered, but because she had chosen a form of adulthood that demands stubbornness. There were nights after the settlement when I sat in the studio and began to pick up a brush again. The first strokes were clumsy because grief sticks like a burr. The second set of strokes had a kind of austerity. I painted in the way a teacher returns to a blackboard, one line at a time, marking out what remains true. The canvas I began was large and at first a confusion of gray. Over weeks, it became a layered thing, layers like strata, like the maps Joshua had loved to draw. I painted a section of the farm, a horse's silhouette, an abstract of red lines that suggested seams beneath the soil. You're doing the right thing, I told her, and in that moment, right was less moral trumpeting and more the quiet work of becoming awake. She looked older than her 27 years then, not because she had suffered, but because she had chosen a form of adulthood that demands stubbornness. There were nights after the settlement when I sat in the studio and began to pick up a brush again. The first strokes were clumsy because grief sticks like a burr. The second set of strokes had a kind of austerity. I painted in the way a teacher returns to a blackboard, one line at a time, marking out what remains true.
The canvas I began was large and at first a confusion of gray. Over weeks, it became a layered thing, layers like strata, like the maps Joshua had loved to draw. I painted a section of the farm, a horse's silhouette, an abstract of red lines that suggested seams beneath the soil. I thought of Joshua arranging his life like an instruction manual for later. I thought of how people sometimes choose to trick for care. Ellis found a way to help me with small things, fetching tubes of paint, varnish, the proper palette knives. He watched me with the private attention of a man who had stood in too many small rooms of sorrow and learned how to keep company without speech. "You paint like you measure," he said once, and I laughed because it was true. My teacher self liked order, liked process. Painting felt like honoring that order again. We kept Joshua's videos like a ritual. Sometimes I would play one at dawn and we would watch together. Jenna leaning on a chair, Ellis with coffee, Lillian checking the next day's filings. The videos had a warmth and a mischief. Joshua would guide us through small acts of estate management, the way a man guides a student through an exercise. Patient, a little teasing, always oddly tender. In one video, he said, "Make the place a place worth visiting, Catherine. Don't let it sit like a memorial to regret. Use it like a life." We used it like a life. The trust we negotiated included a community fund for preservation and a prohibition on certain kinds of drilling that would have compromised the land ecology. The companies agreed, in principle, to phased exploration under strict oversight and to a restoration fund that would pay for land anchors, reforestation, and habitat planning. The protections were not miraculous, but they were concrete. They required ongoing oversight, public reports, and community seats on the trust board. They required that any medical testing follow the ethical standards we insisted upon: independent counsel, informed consent, and no coercion. When we signed the settlement, the room held something like relief. It was not a triumph of the righteous. It was a compromise that leaned toward care. The Mitchells left with options still open, but with legal strings that made exploitative movement more difficult and more visible. I did not feel triumphant so much as tired and steadied. In the months that followed, the farm settled into a new rhythm. There were boring, ordinary things to attend to: the paperwork associated with trust funds, the visits of environmental consultants, the slow legalese. There were brighter things, too. The canvas in the great room, finished, a swirl of red and equine silhouette. Jenna teaching the stable hands how to brush a horse. Ellis showing me how to put shoes on midnight in a winter when the ground was icy. We also found, tucked into one of Joshua's envelopes, a set of letters he had written to half-siblings he had told himself he might never meet. He had found them, indefinitely, in places, and had left contact cards with an instruction to reach out if they might be a better match for medical needs. He had done it quietly, with his habit of trying to keep people from being alone. We reached one of those half-siblings eventually, a woman named Mariah who lived 3 provinces away. She had a voice like sunlight and agreed, after due process and counsel, to be involved in Jenna's care as both family and as a person who knew what it was to be asked. The point is not that clinics were spared drama. Medical decisions always come with care and uncertainty, but that Joshua had left enough options that Jenna was not cornered into an untenable position. The art returned to me slowly, like language finding itself after a speechless winter. I painted in the studio he had made for me, large strokes, small truths, colors that were both honest and consoling. I finished the great canvas and placed it over the mantel for company. It felt right there, holding a certain piece of truth that did not feel like a sermon. People visited, friends brought pies and stories, neighbors came with questions and campfire offers. The community board met in the great room on a long wooden table and argued, sometimes politely, sometimes heatedly, about how best to steward the land. They loved the farm in the way people love things they imagine were always theirs. Some had memories of old harvests, others had a new sense of guardianship. Everyone wanted to help in their own way. Jenna and I developed a ritual. Every evening, we would play one of Joshua's videos if we felt like it, not because we needed instruction any longer, but because his voice had been a companion through a strange season. Sometimes we listened and laughed at his dry asides. Sometimes we listened with tearful, grateful faces, remembering the man who had orchestrated so many small salvations. In those videos, he continued to be our wise, slightly mischievous presence, reminding us, in ways he always had, to measure kindness like a tool and to leave the land better than we found it. There were costs that did not vanish. Grief persisted like a background weather pattern. It would come in gusts at odd moments. I still expected his hand on the back of the chair when I reached for a cup. Some days the absence hit like a physical ache. But there were also a new set of satisfactions, the feeling of being competent in the world again, the quiet victories of showing up, the slow, clean pleasure of painting a line and knowing where it sat on the canvas. The Mitchells were part of the story that would always read as complicated. They had not been monsters so much as men taught to privilege a certain kind of measure. The settlement made room for some dignity and also required transparency. We did not humiliate them for the pleasure of it. We used the instruments Joshua had left, maps, audits, counsel, and used them the way one uses a compass in fog to point true north. In time, Jenna settled into the farm as a partner and not as someone to be brokered. She began to take on trustee responsibilities and took courses in conservation and community engagement.
She was not required to choose between her father and her future. At the great room table, she and I signed the documents that formalized the trust and the oversight board. We placed the first dispensation into the restoration fund and watched as the little seed of money began to grow into a plan that included reforestation and habitat planning. On a day that smelled like late spring, with the maples green and the horses nervous in their stalls, I set the finished canvas in the great room and stood back. It was a painting that married the solvents of grief with the oils of care. A horizon line where the land met a sky that did not promise easy answers, but promised space. Across the lower right corner, I painted, discreetly, a small pressed red rose, his signature beneath the surface, so that when the light hit the canvas at certain hours, you could see the quiet touch of the man who had started this process with a key and a map. That evening we gathered, not a victory party so much as a thing close to peace. Lillian toasted with sparkling water. Harrison and Thomas stood awkwardly polite but sincere. Ellis brought a thermos of coffee and a grin. Jenna read a short passage from a letter Joshua had written her when she was 15. He had tucked it into one of his folders, a private thing he could not say in life without troubling her. She read it aloud, voice steady, and at the end she folded the paper and put it into the trust archive. Later, when the visitors had left and the house was quiet, I sat in the studio with a small lamp on and watched one of Joshua's last videos. He looked at the camera the way he always did, like he was talking to me through the narrowness of a throat. "If you ever doubt your right to the place," he said, "remember why you were trusted. It's not because you were naive or because you were his wife. It's because you know the difference between possession and stewardship. Promise me you'll keep looking. Promise me you'll let the land teach you." I could not promise him then, because promises to the dead are the particular kind of folly we all practice. But I could live in a way that answered him. I could be the sort of person who kept a watchful kindness, who argued for restraint, who painted and participated in the boards and ensured that the restoration fund had teeth. Sometimes, late at night, I would walk out to the gate and look at the dark sweep of the property. The maples would shiver in the wind, and the stars would appear like a ledger of small lights.
I would press the brass key into my palm and feel the warmth of metal and memory. People ask me now, sometimes, what it felt like to be tricked by love. The question assumes a simplicity that doesn't exist. He had tricked them, yes, the Mitchells who thought in ledgers and not in legacies, by preparing a set of constraints that would make their quick appetites impossible without witnesses.
But he had also tricked me in the best sense. He had forced me to be braver than my comfort demanded. He had made a choice that kept a place and a life from being taken from us by the flimsy appetites of men who measured everything by their last column. I do not claim a miraculous end. The brothers were not drummed from town in disgrace. They left with legal obligations that would be tested. Their reputations had been exposed to scrutiny. The fight had consequences for us, too. Grief runs slow and practical things take time. But we emerged with a living place where horses grazed and people knew that stewardship had been chosen over quick profit. Joshua's trick had been a layered thing: map and deed, video and audit, contact and counsel. It had not been cruelty. It had been care that anticipated greed and designed constraints that turned aggression into negotiation. The farm is our daily argument with time. We rebuild fences, tend the trees, paint in the studio, and maintain the trust's meetings. We keep one of Joshua's rules loosely. We watch one video if we need counsel, and otherwise we live. Our ritual changed from obedience to a man to an ongoing conversation with memory and future. On the first anniversary of his death, Jenna and I walked the ridge where the red lines had once convinced industry men to stay honest. We placed a small plaque there, not to mark a victory, but to mark a promise, for restoration, for care, for future watchfulness. The plaque had no great words. It had a simple phrase I had painted onto a card in my studio and then had Lillian translate into formal language for the archive. When I pressed the small red rose, long since glossy with resins, into the envelope and slid it into the archive beneath the great canvas, I felt something settle. There was sadness always. There was also a sense that the man who had said, "Never go to the farm, Catherine, promise me," had, in his tricky way, given us an offering that would last longer than the impulse to take. The forbidden place became our sanctuary. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves a tale of family and stubborn care, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Catherine's place?